Late November 1943. Western Desert Sector, inland from the North African coast. The British Eighth Army had already advanced past several abandoned Axis defensive lines, and logistics units were under pressure to move fuel and ammunition forward faster than the infantry could secure ground. The war in this region had shifted from maneuver to sustainment. Vehicles now mattered more than tanks. Every lost truck meant delayed artillery support somewhere else along the front. Lieutenant Arthur Bennett, age 26, Royal Army Service Corps, had not expected combat responsibility when he joined the Army in 1940. He had trained as a railway clerk before the war and spent most of his service organizing shipping manifests in Alexandria. 3 months earlier, he was reassigned to convoy escort duty after repeated personnel shortages. His role was simple on paper: keep the trucks moving, maintain spacing, and report hazards. He was not trained to fight positional defenses. At 9:40, Bennett's convoy entered grid sector F-12, an area marked on British maps as cleared. The marking meant infantry patrols had crossed it without resistance 2 days earlier. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed no fortifications. The route was approved by Corps headquarters. The terrain was flat, dry, and empty. Visibility exceeded 3 kilometers in every direction. The convoy consisted of 12 Bedford trucks loaded with fuel drums and ration crates, 1 repair vehicle, and a light armored car at the front. Drivers maintained interval distance exactly as briefed. No one spoke on the radio except for routine speed adjustments. Several drivers later described the moment identically. There was no warning. At 9:52, a shell struck the second truck. The explosion destroyed the cab and ignited fuel containers. Within 3 seconds, machine gun fire swept the column from the right flank at ground level. The armored car returned fire immediately, but aimed at open sand. No muzzle flashes were visible. No smoke trails were visible. The sound indicated fixed guns, not mobile weapons. Bennett left his vehicle and attempted to identify a firing position through binoculars. He reported seeing nothing except heat distortion over dunes. He ordered dispersal into a shallow depression 30 meters off the track, but a second artillery round destroyed the last truck, sealing the convoy inside the impact zone. The attack lasted approximately 4 minutes. When firing stopped, 11 men were dead and 4 wounded. The enemy did not continue engagement and did not attempt capture. No movement was detected afterward. The area returned to complete silence. At 13:10, a reconnaissance aircraft photographed the location. The prints arrived at headquarters before sunset. Intelligence officers compared the images to pre-attack photographs taken the previous morning. No structural differences were identified. There were only impact craters and burned vehicles. The official interpretation formed quickly. Major Colin Reeves, sector operations officer, had served in France in 1940 and retained strong opinions about battlefield reporting. He believed inexperienced officers often misjudged direction under fire. After reviewing Bennett's statement, he concluded the convoy had deviated from the approved route by at least several hundred meters and entered an uncleared pocket of resistance. The map, he decided, remained reliable. Bennett was questioned for 2 hours that evening. He insisted the compass heading was correct and the landmarks matched the route briefing, though there were almost no physical markers in the terrain. While speaking, he struggled to maintain certainty because he understood how implausible his report sounded. He described guns firing from ground that showed no gun positions. He knew how that appeared to staff officers responsible for planning. His written report was filed with the notation, "Probable navigational error under combat stress." The drivers who survived gave consistent accounts, but none could provide directional bearings precise enough to challenge the map. They remembered only sound without source. The armored car gunner admitted firing at empty space. The investigation at this stage was administrative rather than tactical. Headquarters' immediate goal was preventing logistical delay, not reevaluating reconnaissance doctrine. Replacement trucks were scheduled for the following morning. The supply timetable could not pause for an unexplained incident. Outwardly, the matter was settled. Privately, Major Reeves added a remark in his field notebook. Either the convoy drifted off course, or we were missing something stationary. No further action was authorized that day. The route remained open for traffic. The sector classification did not change. The opening phase of the investigation, therefore, began not with a search for an enemy position, but with a decision to trust the map over the witnesses. The responsibility now rested on whether the next convoy would confirm the report or contradict it. The next convoy moved at first light under stricter spacing orders and with a second armored car attached. The route coordinates were verified 3 separate times before departure, once by the transport officer, once by signals, and once by a navigation sergeant assigned specifically to prevent a repeat of the previous incident. The drivers were instructed to maintain visual alignment with a white marker flag mounted on the lead vehicle to remove any dependence on individual judgment. Major Colin Reeves observed the departure personally. He had ordered the additional escort, not because he expected resistance, but because higher command required visible precaution after the casualty report. His working assumption remained that the earlier convoy had crossed an uncleared pocket that patrols simply missed. The desert was large enough for mistakes, and mistakes were easier to correct than unknown weapons. The column advanced into the same sector shortly after 8:20. Wind conditions were mild. Tire tracks from recovery vehicles of the previous day were still faintly visible, confirming alignment with the earlier route. The burned frames of destroyed trucks remained where they had been dragged aside, blackened metal lying in open sand without cover or obstruction. Engineers had inspected the site during the night and found no buried wiring, no mines, and no dug positions within 50 meters of the impacts. At 8:43, wireless operators intercepted a brief German transmission. The signal lasted less than 4 seconds and contained no recognizable words, only a short coded burst followed by silence. Direction-finding equipment suggested the origin was somewhere within the same grid square. Reeves noted it, but did not halt the convoy. He reasoned that scattered retreating units often transmitted blindly while relocating and that no firing had yet occurred. At 8:47, the first machine gun burst struck the ground directly in front of the lead armored car, precisely bracketing the road line rather than sweeping across open terrain. Within 2 seconds, artillery fire followed from a separate angle, landing behind the convoy center vehicles and cutting off withdrawal. The firing pattern showed adjustment between rounds, indicating observers were correcting aim in real time. The escort vehicles fired toward the apparent sound direction, but the rounds impacted only sand ridges. No recoil dust, no silhouettes, and no muzzle flash appeared. The gunners reported hearing metal casings ejecting somewhere below ground level rather than across distance. The attack again lasted only minutes before stopping abruptly. When the firing ceased, 3 trucks were disabled and 6 men wounded. This time, no vehicles burned. The drivers had dispersed immediately and avoided fuel ignition. A perimeter search extended 100 meters in every direction. Nothing was found except impact marks and scattered cartridge links half buried in wind-blown sand, too corroded to have been freshly exposed, yet not present the day before. The coded transmission was logged again immediately after the firing stopped, shorter than the first. Reeves arrived on site within an hour. He walked the ground himself without helmet, crouching at each crater while an artillery captain calculated trajectories. The firing angles suggested fixed guns at shallow elevation, but no physical positions existed along those bearings. The mathematics placed the weapons beneath open terrain where no excavation marks could survive even a moderate wind. The possibility of a signaling informant became the next explanation. The convoy timing had not been public, yet the firing began within minutes of entry into the sector. Attention turned to a contracted local guide assigned to water transport units who had been near the dispatch yard that morning. Military police detained him before noon. The interrogation lasted the afternoon. He spoke limited English and denied any contact with German forces. Searches of his belongings revealed nothing but ration coupons and a worn photograph of family members. Signals officers attempted to match the coded transmissions to handheld devices or concealed transmitters, but found no compatible equipment in the area. His timeline did not match the moment of signal detection. Witnesses placed him several kilometers away, repairing a pump, when the first burst was intercepted. Meanwhile, ballistic examination of recovered shell fragments reached a separate conclusion. The artillery rounds were of a consistent manufacturing batch and bore markings from fixed emplacement guns rather than mobile field pieces. The wear pattern suggested repeated firing from the same barrels over time, not a roving battery relocating between attacks. By evening, Reeves reviewed both findings together. A local informant could explain timing, but not stationary artillery signatures. Mobile guns could explain ambush tactics, but not the absence of tracks or displacement marks. Neither theory aligned fully with the physical evidence. He amended the sector status from cleared to uncertain, a classification rarely used because it offered no operational guidance. Convoys could not stop moving, yet the map could no longer be trusted as complete. That night, he wrote a revised operational note. Enemy fire originates from fixed weapons positioned where no visible positions exist. Observation method unknown. Engagement ceases immediately after disabling transport rather than pursuing survivors. The investigation changed character at that point. The question was no longer whether the convoy had made a mistake, but how guns could operate repeatedly in open desert without leaving a location to attack. Movement through the sector was suspended for heavy transport, but not for reconnaissance. Small patrols were ordered to cross the area on foot rather than by vehicle in order to reduce noise and vibration that could alert observers. The task fell to a mixed group of infantry scouts and 2 combat engineers who carried probing rods and demolition charges in case buried mines were discovered. They entered the grid shortly after sunrise, advancing in a staggered line with 30 meters between each man. The ground appeared uniform. The wind had smoothed the previous day's tire marks until they were barely visible. No fresh tracks led in or out. The patrol commander, Sergeant Halvorsen, stopped repeatedly to listen. The desert carried sound clearly in the morning. Distant engines could be heard from several kilometers away, yet within the sector there was only the wind and loose sand shifting across the surface. At the center of the previous attack area, the engineers began probing. The rods penetrated easily to a consistent depth before meeting compacted layers typical of wind-packed dunes. They struck no boards, no metal, and no voids. After 40 minutes, they reported negative results and prepared to withdraw. While regrouping, one scout noticed a faint vibration through his boots, too weak to hear, but detectable when standing still. The men knelt and placed hands flat on the ground. The sensation repeated twice at irregular intervals. The engineer assumed distant artillery practice beyond the horizon, but Halvorsen ordered a wider sweep to confirm. They advanced another 80 meters east. The vibration stopped. When they stepped back toward the original position, it resumed briefly, then ceased again. The patrol marked the location with a small signal flag and withdrew without further incident. No firing occurred during the entire crossing. The report reached Major Reeves that afternoon. He compared the marked coordinates to trajectory estimates calculated after the last ambush. The point lay between predicted gun lines rather than directly over them. The pattern suggested activity below ground, transmitting through compacted layers rather than surface impact. That evening, a captured German supply driver previously held for routine questioning requested to speak again. Through an interpreter, he clarified a statement he had made earlier, insisting his unit delivered ammunition to entrances that were not entrances. He described unloading crates beside ordinary terrain features at night, while engineers measured distances carefully with rope rather than landmarks. He never saw the weapons themselves. He was told the guns did not require exposure to fire. Engineers reviewed the description and compared it with the patrol's vibration observation. A hypothesis formed that weapons could be firing from reinforced chambers below grade, using narrow openings not visible from standard viewing angles. However, aerial photographs still showed uninterrupted dune curvature. If openings existed, they were not vertical shafts. To test whether sound direction had misled previous escorts, a controlled experiment was ordered. A single empty truck, operated remotely by a long tow cable from an armored vehicle positioned behind a ridge, was driven slowly across the sector at dusk while observers watched through field glasses from multiple bearings. The truck crossed the first half of the grid without incident. As it approached the previously marked vibration point, a short artillery burst struck 30 meters ahead of its path, correcting immediately with a second round landing beside the vehicle. Observers on three sides recorded sound arrival from slightly different bearings, none pointing to a visible firing position. The truck was destroyed. No follow-up shots came after it stopped moving. The observers remained in place for nearly an hour. During that time, one artillery lieutenant reported seeing a brief puff of dust far behind a dune line unrelated to the impact direction. The distance was too great for confirmation, and by the time a patrol reached the location under darkness, the wind had erased any trace. Reeves studied the combined reports late into the night. The guns were stationary. They fired only when vehicles crossed specific ground. Their position could not be determined by sound, sight, or trajectory alone. The driver's description of concealed delivery points and the patrol's ground vibrations suggested a structure designed to remain entirely beneath the surface except for minimal openings placed away from the firing direction. He authorized a limited technical consultation the following morning, requesting assistance not from Artillery Command, but from a civilian specialist attached to engineering surveys, whose duties normally involve groundwater mapping rather than combat analysis. The situation had moved beyond conventional field fortification logic and required someone accustomed to interpreting terrain for features that could not be seen directly. The civilian specialist arrived under escort shortly after noon, carrying a canvas case of measuring tools more suited to well construction than battlefield inspection. His name was Dr. Elias Kessler, 58 years old, a reserve officer assigned to the Water Survey section of the Logistics Corps. Before the war, he had spent 3 decades mapping mineral deposits in arid regions of the British Mandate territories. His wartime role normally involved identifying stable drilling points for supply wells and advising engineers where heavy vehicles would not sink into hidden soft ground. He listened to the operational briefing without interruption and asked only for the exact locations where vehicles had been struck, not the calculated firing directions. The request appeared counterintuitive to the artillery officers present, but Reeves approved it. A small escort accompanied Kessler into the sector on foot to avoid disturbing the surface. The ground still showed scattered fragments from the destroyed test vehicle. Kessler did not examine the wreckage first. Instead, he knelt at several points along the convoy line and ran sand slowly through his fingers, then rubbed it against the inside of his wrist before placing a small amount on his tongue. The soldiers watched without comment. He repeated the process at intervals of a few meters, occasionally marking a position with a thin wooden peg from his case. At one point, he asked the escort to remain still for several minutes. He crouched low, observing how loose grains shifted in the wind along a shallow slope that otherwise appeared identical to its surroundings. The wind direction that day matched the recorded conditions of the attacks, yet a narrow strip of sand showed a subtle cross-pattern inconsistent with prevailing airflow. He moved away from the impact craters entirely and stopped roughly 60 meters beyond where the artillery calculations had suggested the guns might be. There he requested a probe rod from the engineers. He pushed it into the ground at a shallow angle rather than vertically. After 30 centimeters, the rod struck resistance, not characteristic of compacted sand, but of a flat surface. He withdrew it and smelled the tip before handing it to Reeves. The metal carried a faint petroleum odor despite the absence of any surface contamination nearby. Kessler requested a controlled excavation no larger than a ration crate. Engineers began digging cautiously. At a depth of half a meter, they exposed the top of a narrow pipe, no wider than a man's wrist, angled downward into darkness. The pipe was capped with a fine mesh filter nearly indistinguishable from surrounding grit. When removed, A slight warmth rose from below, along with a trace of stale air. The opening was expanded carefully. Beneath it lay a reinforced concrete ceiling buried under compacted sand. The structure showed no cracks, no surface edges, and no vertical entrance shaft. Further clearing revealed that the pipe did not lead directly into a chamber but angled away at a distance, preventing any visible disturbance directly above the firing point. Combat engineers widened the breach at dusk undercover positions. After cutting through the roof with shaped charges, they lowered a lamp into the opening. The light revealed an enclosed firing room large enough for two artillery pieces mounted on fixed pivots, their barrels aligned toward the convoy route through narrow horizontal slits concealed at ground level several dozen meters away from the ventilation outlet. No personnel remained inside. Ammunition racks were partially empty, suggesting recent use and organized withdrawal through a tunnel extending deeper underground beyond immediate reach. Reeves walked around the excavation perimeter in silence while the engineers documented measurements. The gun positions corresponded precisely with the earlier trajectory calculations, but the visible evidence existed only after deliberate penetration of a surface that appeared untouched from any normal observation distance. Kessler explained that airflow, heat, and exhaust particles from enclosed firing produced microscopic deposits carried upward through ventilation, altering mineral taste and cohesion patterns in nearby sand. The effect was too slight for sight, but consistent to physical examination. The operational assumption that observation required visible structure had concealed the emplacement completely. The guns had not been hidden behind terrain. They had been placed beneath it, with their openings displaced far enough from their ventilation points to mislead direction estimates. Reeves ordered the area secured and sent immediate notice to command that the sector contained engineered subterranean defenses rather than scattered raiding units. The investigation shifted from locating attackers to mapping an underground network whose entrances were designed never to appear as entrances at all. By morning, the excavation site was covered with camouflage netting and guarded as if it were an ammunition depot. Engineers sealed the breached roof after photographing the chamber and left the firing mechanisms untouched. Orders from Corps Command were explicit. The position was now evidence, not a target. The priority had shifted from destroying a single emplacement to understanding how many more existed. Dr. Kessler requested transport along a wider perimeter rather than returning to headquarters. He carried a notebook in which he recorded distances between the ventilation pipe and the firing slit that engineers had measured overnight. Using those measurements, he calculated a rough spacing pattern that such structures would require to avoid interfering airflow between neighboring chambers. Instead of moving along obvious tactical ground, he directed the escort across open flats that officers had previously ignored because they offered no cover and therefore no assumed military value. Every 50 meters, he stopped briefly, crouched, and tested sand texture between his fingers before marking certain points while leaving most untouched. The soldiers noticed that he avoided ridgelines entirely and preferred shallow basins where wind left consistent layering. At the third mark point, he ordered no digging. Instead, he asked artillery observers to position themselves 200 meters away behind a low rise. A single smoke grenade was thrown onto the marked ground. After several seconds, the smoke stream bent sharply sideways at ankle height, although the upper column moved normally with the wind. The ground itself was venting air. A careful excavation exposed another pipe, identical in construction, but connected to a deeper chamber containing twin machine gun mounts rather than artillery. Ammunition crates were stacked against the wall, with German markings intact. The weapons were aligned to sweep the convoy path at a shallow angle that would strike drivers rather than engines, explaining why previous vehicles had halted intact, yet immobilized. Later that afternoon, a patrol moving further east discovered faint boot impressions inside a narrow depression between dunes, preserved only because the area lay shielded from prevailing wind. The tracks led to a patch of terrain indistinguishable from surrounding sand. Digging revealed a sloped tunnel entrance concealed beneath a removable packed layer reinforced with woven matting and sand glued by oil residue. The tunnel extended toward multiple chambers, confirming that the firing rooms were part of a connected defensive system rather than isolated traps. Inside one corridor, they found abandoned ration tins dated 2 weeks prior and a maintenance log written in German technical shorthand. It listed numbered positions and ventilation maintenance intervals rather than firing schedules. The defenders had expected to remain underground for extended periods, surfacing only to resupply through distant access points during darkness. Reeves compared the numbering in the log to the spacing Kessler predicted earlier that day. The intervals matched. The pattern indicated an organized grid covering a large section of the supposed cleared sector. Instead of ordering immediate demolition, Reeves halted all movement through adjacent zones and requested full artillery registration of each located chamber. The earlier losses were no longer random encounters, but engagements with a prepared defensive network mapped deliberately to target supply routes rather than frontline troops. That evening, he drafted a revised operational directive. No convoy would cross the area until every marked position was either opened or confirmed empty. The investigation had moved from identifying a hidden weapon to charting a system designed to remain invisible while controlling movement across an entire corridor of desert. Over the following days, the sector was treated less like a battlefield and more like an engineering survey. Small escorted teams moved slowly across measured lanes, while artillery observers recorded coordinates with precise range tables. Each marked location was examined before any demolition order was given. The intention was to understand the full defensive layout before removing it. The numbering system found in the underground log proved consistent. Every new chamber uncovered corresponded to a predictable interval, forming staggered rows designed to cover road approaches without overlapping fields of fire. The spacing ensured that a convoy disabling its lead vehicle would halt within range of at least 2 additional positions. Several chambers were empty but maintained, indicating rotation rather than abandonment. During a night patrol near the edge of the mapped grid, infantry encountered 3 German soldiers emerging from a concealed access tunnel while carrying water containers. They surrendered immediately when challenged, appearing more surprised than resistant. Their uniforms were clean despite weeks of desert operations, and their boots carried dust matching the tunnel interior rather than the surface terrain. Under questioning, they explained that crews remained underground for long durations to avoid aerial detection, rotating between chambers through internal passages that linked to distant supply entrances beyond the convoy route. They described firing only at transport vehicles because orders emphasized delaying supply movement rather than engaging combat units. Once vehicles stopped moving, they were instructed to cease fire to avoid revealing the system's extent. Using the prisoners' information, engineers traced the main tunnel to a concealed entrance over a kilometer away from the firing line, hidden within a shallow rocky outcrop that aircraft had photographed repeatedly without suspicion. The entrance had been used nightly by supply parties carrying ammunition and water, leaving almost no tracks due to stone ground and controlled foot traffic. After the final locations were confirmed, artillery batteries registered each chamber in sequence. At dawn, coordinated fire collapsed the reinforced roofs. Secondary detonations from stored ammunition followed in several positions, while others fell silent after direct hits sealed their ventilation shafts. No return fire occurred. Later that afternoon, armored vehicles crossed the route without incident. Engineers remained behind to document construction details and record measurements for future manuals. The convoy drivers who passed through slowed automatically near the former impact sites, though no order required caution anymore. Major Reeves submitted a corrected report rescinding earlier disciplinary findings against the transport officers. The amendment was administrative and circulated only within command channels. Dr. Kessler declined formal recognition and returned to survey duty, noting only that airflow leaves traces even where structures cannot be seen. The sector was reclassified as secured once more, this time with map justification. The hidden positions had not been removed by chance, but by understanding their design. and the supply corridor remained open without further loss.